we're in the unique circumstances here of St Joseph's Church down in Sailorstown in Belfast, and we're here for a discussion on the theme of education, leaning towards discussion on educational underachievement, and we're coming at it from different perspectives. Broadly speaking, there will be a Republican perspective, a Loyalist perspective, and other perspectives too. So we'll start with a few introductions, just a few words as to who we are and indeed what our interest in education is. So I'll start by saying that my name is Peter Finn. I am the head of St Mary's University College, Falls Road in Belfast. The main mission of the institution is the education of teachers, hopefully very good teachers, because the whole purpose of teacher education is to enhance the education of children. And I am the co-chair of today's discussion, and will hand over now to Noel, who'll say a few words about himself.
Thanks, Peter. My name is Noel Purdy. I'm Director of Research at Stranmillis University College, a sister college of St Mary's, also very involved in teacher education. And I'm Director of the Centre for Research in Educational Underachievement. And like Peter, the mission of Stranmillis is to prepare the very best teachers for our community here in Northern Ireland and further afield.
Thank you. And over to Emma.
Hello, my name's Emma Shaw. I am a community activist within East Belfast, and my focus on research is within educational research underachievement in the area. Thank
you. And Robert?
My name's Robert Nimblock. I'm a Loyalist ex-prisoner, served from 1973 until 1990. Also worked for EPIC, Ex-Prisoners Interpretive Centre, that looked after UVF and Red Hand Commando prisoners and their dependents from 1997 to 2001. And I still do some volunteer work for EPIC, do some volunteer work for ACT, and I'm also a writer.
Thank you, Robert. And over to Mickey.
Hello, I'm Michael Culbert. I'm a former Republican prisoner. I spent 16 years in Long Case. I have a very good, in-depth interest in education, the process of education, structure of education, and I'm delighted to be part of this here this morning.
Thank you very much. And finally, Jennifer.
Hello, my name's Jennifer McCann. I'm also an ex-Republican prisoner, and I basically served 10 years in prison. Pardon me, I was part of the previous discussion. I was asked to do this by Kusha, by Michael. And I suppose, again, I have a keen interest in education as well, because I feel that it's a very, very important issue. And, you know, for people, not just in learning in terms of academic education, but learning, lifelong learning in general for all, particularly young people.
Well, thank you all for that. So that's who we are, and that's your panel, so to speak, online as it is in this rather unique Féile. So the first area of discussion is going to be led by my colleague Noel. So Noel, if you'd like to kick off on that one.
Okay, thanks Peter. So the first area we're going to look at is really, I suppose, setting the context for where we all come from with our views about education today. The main focus of the session, as Peter has suggested, is about educational underachievement and very much rooted in today's contemporary society. But before we get to that, we're keen to hear about your own experiences of education, informal and formal, growing up at various stages through the 60s, 70s, 80s. And so maybe I will go around and just hear a little bit about how your experiences shaped your trajectory and how the surrounding environment, perhaps of the Troubles, shaped that as well, before we move on into talking about education today. So I'm going to start with Jennifer, if I may. Jennifer, if you'd like to just tell us briefly about your childhood experiences of education set in that very troubled period in our history.
Well, I think like most people of my age, I was 12 in 1972, and we had to actually move home at the time. So in terms of my formal education, it was interrupted, in a sense that, you know, you had to move to a totally different area because you were intimidated out of your home. And we moved then into West Belfast. And we went to different schools then. And I suppose at that age, it was very difficult, you know, settling into different schools and that. So in terms of my formal education, the conflict did interrupt that education. And again, that went on then because obviously West Belfast was one of the most militarised areas in Europe at that time, in the early 70s. A lot of people were being killed, a lot of people were going to prison, a lot of people injured. And I think that like most people of my age, our education was then very much interrupted. Pardon me. So in terms of formal education, most people that I knew and most people of my sort of generation didn't go beyond maybe what was called O-levels then. It was quite unique if you went on to do A-levels, and it was very, very unique for going to university at that stage. I think I remember it was just one person I knew, in that sort of community, that social circle that we had. And again then, I like to emphasise this, I don't think education is just about specific academic qualifications. I think there's a bit of too much of an emphasis put on it, and I think that in terms of young people in particular, I think that they have a lot of skills, they have a lot of talents, and I think that all should be nurtured in a way, that the academic side is, and unfortunately it's not. It is in other countries. In the like of Germany and that, the like of you have the like of vocational education and that. But for me then, I did most of my formal education in jail. So when I went into prison, I was probably one of the oldest in prison then, and I was only 20. I just turned 20. But a lot of the women that were in then were just young girls when they came into prison. So very similar circumstances to myself. Their education was interrupted. And I think that a lot of us then, we didn't have any access on protest to books or education or classes or that. So we sort of organised ourselves in terms of that. And some people would have taken like a history classes, Irish history and that. Again, Irish history was something that you didn't really learn a lot at the education system when I was growing up as a child. And I think that again, for me, it was about reading books. I was a very keen reader, even as a young person. Reading books and finding all that out. And I suppose educating yourself, that's what we did in prison. A lot of us, a lot of Republican prisoners, we educate ourselves, but it wasn't just for ourselves. We educated ourselves to pass it on to our communities and the people, whenever we come out of prison again.
So education in a way had a different value in prison and a broader purpose, perhaps. I'm gonna move across here to Emma to hear another female perspective and just to hear your experiences of what education was like or how it was valued in your community growing up in East Belfast.
So, so I grew up in East Belfast in the tail end. So I was in the 80s going to school. So it was a bit of a different experience than Jennifer. But I do agree with what she said in terms of we focus very much on academic abilities and academic skills, and we don't focus or put enough emphasis on vocational skills, which are just as valued. We can have all the doctors in the world, but who's going to build the hospitals? Who's going to look after the plumbing? Who's going to look after the machines? And I think that's something that we really need to address within Northern Ireland. I grew up in a single parent family with other brothers and sisters, and during the 80s, and everybody in this room will know, that our economy was non-existent. We didn't have access to, foreign direct investment or anything like what we do now. So the likes of, your clothes or whatever you would get in the grocery store or whatever. School, for me, my mum really pushed us in school. Between me and my sister, there was a bit of a competition, at the kitchen table, who was going to get their homework done first. And my sister is way cleverer than me. But it was always that little bit of push for me. And in school, it was very focused. And I went to school in East Belfast, and I don't think I really understood anything much about the Troubles when I was in primary school. I didn't know anybody from the other community. It was very insular experience, and it wasn't until I then went to post-primary school, because at that time the 11 plus was still a thing, and we were very much taught to the 11 plus. We were very much taught sitting in your rows in school to do your times tables, your spellings, everything else. I still remember doing my 11 plus paper sitting at the back of the class. I remember exactly where I was sitting. And I was lucky enough that I passed my 11 plus and was able to go to a grammar school. And it was really only then, when I went to the grammar school, that I started to see how different my upbringing was compared to other people, because I went to an all-girls grammar school that attracted pupils from Newtownards and Bangor and other areas, and it was only then that I met people from the Catholic background. And I kind of then wondered, why did I never meet anybody from the... And it was only then that I started to realise the impact of the Troubles, at the time. And obviously I've reflected on that a lot more as I've become older. But when you're younger, because that's what it is, you don't really think about it that much because that's what you're used to. But I reflect on the difference of my education, probably very different to these guys given our little bit of an age difference, but that even is different to my children's education as well, and to the younger people's education now.
Okay, thanks, Emma. I'll maybe stay over at this side and move on to Robert. And I wasn't going to mention age difference here at all, but Robert, I wonder, is there a slightly different perspective from you and when you grew up? And I'm interested to know whether education was valued. Emma has told us that education did have a place and a value in her home, but we hear often about, the Loyalist community and Protestant working class underachievement, and it's really encouraging to hear that Emma's bucking the trend here. But Robert, what's your perspective?
My perspective, Noel, I was born in the 1950s in what would be considered now an interface area. I came from the bottom of Woodstock, Ravenhill Road area, which adjoined the Short Strand. And in the early 1960s, I went to a local primary school, Nettlefield. I was there from I was 5 until I was 9. And at that stage, that school served as a stepping stone to another school, Euston Street, which is further up the road, where you went for 2 years to prepare you for the 11 plus, which was a big thing in those days. In the area I came from, most people went to the same secondary school. It was Park Parade, which was on the Ravenhill Road, huge secondary school. Maybe further up the road they went to Orangefield or something like that. But it was unusual for people in that area to go to grammar schools, although some did. My next door neighbour, son, who was about 6 years older than me, had already been to a grammar school, Annandale Grammar. And I can remember my mum saying to me all the time, "You should be like William, you should be like William. Look at what he's done. He's went to grammar school." When in 1966, I was lucky enough, like Emma says, to pass the 11 plus. I didn't know that I was privileged to pass it. In the class that I was in that year, there was 4 of us passed. There was myself and another guy and 2 girls. We went to separate grammar schools. I went to Annandale, the same as my next door neighbour William. And all of my friends who had sat the 11 plus with me failed and went to Park Parade. I resented that a bit. I really wanted to go to Park Parade. And there was a cost aspect to it as well, because when you went to grammar school in those days, you had to buy books, you had to buy PT equipment, all that sort of stuff, which my mum and dad couldn't really afford. My dad was a docker, worked around here, he worked in a low dock. My ma worked in a laundry in Dundonald Hospital. But 2 months after I qualified, or I went to grammar school, they split up. So I came from a single parent family. My mum found it hard. But she kept me going at school anyway. And I stayed there until 1970. The Troubles broke out in 1969. And where I came from, it was a real hotspot for the Troubles. I became involved in that there as a young writer. And by the time the next summer came along, 1970, I didn't want to go to school any longer. Started baking off school and eventually left that summer, where, and all my friends stayed on and went on to do great things. But I seen education then, the first couple of years I was at grammar school, I probably valued education more when I was at primary school, because you knew that, it's like the reading, writing and arithmetic, that's what was going to stand you in good stead for the future. When I went to grammar school, I found that your interest coincided with teachers you liked or teachers that help you. If you didn't like a teacher, he didn't like you, I tended not to do good in that class. And there's this aspect, don't forget, you're still 11, 12, 13, you're in your formative years, and you didn't have the know-all to see it through,
Yeah.
really. You know, so
But you've touched on that. You've
time.
touched on that issue of the quality of teaching and the motivational aspect of having high quality teaching, and I'm sure we'll come back to that.
Well, I think that's hugely important. And that the best teacher I had, and I say this all the time, was, well, there was a few of them. There was a guy called Davy Coffey, who was the head of the junior school, and he's very, very strict disciplinarian. But if you did as he told you, he nurtured you. He was brilliant, and he spent a bit of time with you. You know, and when I went to senior school, then there was another guy who taught English, which I was interested in, and I liked creative writing. He encouraged that, and he was very informal in the way he taught. And again, if he seen that you had a certain string to your bow, he encouraged that. And it wasn't this collective teaching that everybody did the same thing. Okay. And I think that's important. You know?
Okay, thanks, Robert. Yeah, I'm sure we'll come back to that later. Finally, I don't want to leave Mickey out here. Jennifer talked about education being interrupted, I think was a word that Jennifer used, by the Troubles. Is that your experience as well? Or, I mean, certainly Robert talked about it too.
I'm a few years ahead of Jennifer and the rest of them here. No, I had great schooling, full stop. I went to St. Gall's Primary School at Bombay Street in West Belfast. Great experiences between... You didn't really do education, you just went to school. And I think there's a wee bit of a difference there. It's hard for me to explain it, but I never saw it as education, just when you went to school. And I probably was quite lucky because I failed the 11 plus. And I went to St. Thomas's on the Wide Rock Road up at the Ballymurphy there. And great experiences there. A great breadth of education, as in the subjects which were available, and I enjoyed it. And great sporting situation too within the school, which helped. And it tended to be most of the fellas in my class were also involved in the sporting. When I was 16, I got whatever you did. I don't know what in those days. I think it was O levels. We did, and I got about 7 or 8 of them. And I was then on to do the A level, French and history. But I got a part-time, I got a summer job when I was, 17, I think it was, and it was in the civil service. And I liked the money, so I just didn't go back to school. But I was interested in the French because the French teacher was a great fella, and Tony Clifford. And I did the A-level French at night school in St. Thomas's, paid for. And that was my formal educational experience. After I did the A-level French, I had no inclination towards education for years upon years. And it wasn't really until I went into Longcash, until I arrived into Longcash in '79 that I took up an interest in learning anything. It's only in reflection as an adult and having had a good look at education. I'm not an academic, I'm not a Bert in anything, but I have a good interest in the structures of education and the reasons for education and what it is. And I like the way Emma brought out the stuff that she was saying earlier on. I mean, I don't know where this conversation will be going, but I'd like to know the purpose and stuff and the direction and who sets what education is. I'm interested in that type of aspect because I think that is a major problem within particular parts of our community here in the north of Ireland.
Can I ask you briefly then, just did education have a different purpose when you were in Longcash than it might have had when you were at school?
It certainly did. The education which I came involved in, let's say, over the years from having left schooling and that aspect of educational attainment. In later years, as an adult, I saw education as I don't want to use a barbed term, but I saw education as a tool. I saw it as a developmental thing, as opposed to being a qualification. And therefore, I was very heavily involved in assisting the education, the informal education of my comrades in Longcash, purely for political ends. Yeah. That's not for educational achievement, but for political ends. Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah.
I'm conscious of time, so I'm going to hand back to Peter for the next thematic a range of questions.
Right. Those are very interesting perspectives, and I mean, I've listened to a couple of themes that have emerged. Grammar schools and additional costs associated with them. The divide between academic and vocational education is very clear. The great importance of primary education as the basis of virtually everything that comes afterwards. The importance of teachers as role models and as individuals who can really stimulate people to do better. And sport, because Michael here mentioned sport, and I think sport's a critical factor in this. What we'd like to focus on for the next 15 minutes or so is about our present educational environment, but drawing upon your experiences and drawing upon your perspectives. So I'm going to say a few things by way of introduction, which are maybe a little bit controversial, deliberately, and then let's see how you respond. In this jurisdiction, the taxpayer spends over £2 billion in education. That's a lot of money, and that's why it's a really important political issue. Because if $2 billion is going to be allocated to school education in the broadest sense, taxpayers need a view in this. Go back to Michael's comment. What's the purpose of that $2 billion? So that's the first thing I want to tell you. But let me read you some very bad news from the Social Mobility Commission report that's come out very, very recently about the region in which we all live. Almost 1/4, 24% of children here live in a household that, on income levels alone, struggles to provide the basics of heat, food and clothing or meet childcare costs. 24%. Secondly, significant gaps in school attainment between free school meals and non-free school meal students at level 2 are larger for boys, 30.6% as opposed to girls at 27%, and also larger for disadvantaged Protestant pupils, 33.1%, than for disadvantaged Catholic pupils at 27.1%. Now, I don't think those percentages make a big difference. I think the numbers are very high in the first instance, irrespective of gender or indeed of religious affiliation. And the third comment I'm going to make is I recently saw a map of the city of Belfast which set out an overlay which was the wards done on the basis of educational achievement against the level of socioeconomic disadvantage. And the correlation is absolutely extreme. I mean, it is just unbelievable how socioeconomic advantage leads to the outcomes, which albeit are measured in terms of examination results, but they're there. So it isn't a pretty picture. You know, £2 billion of expenditure, and there are significant issues. So, in the light of what I've just said, maybe people would like to contribute their thoughts on some of the issues that our elected members should be thinking about and perhaps acting on in the contemporary world. And this time we'll start with Emma, if you don't mind. So Emma, in the light of some of the descriptions that I've given, we'd be very keen to hear any of the perspectives that you may have on education in today.
Okay, so you mentioned there the amount of money that is spent on our school system, and I do think that that is to do with our heavily segregated schooling system within Northern Ireland. We've got segregation along religious divide, we've got segregation along academic divisions as well, which I don't think are entirely helpful for us as communities to move forward together. So that's the first point I would like to make. Also then, in terms of when we look at the biggest division between academic attainment, which is largely based on class divisions. If you look at inner city areas, or if you look at high areas of social deprivation, as you mentioned with your map, those are the areas that tend to do less well in academic examinations. And we need to look at the issues that play into that. So we've talked about parents being able to pay for school uniforms, but we also need to look at like the grammar school system. Not only are you paying for a wool school blazer at £100 or your multiple PE kits, you're paying for school trips because you don't want your child to be disadvantaged compared to other kids. You know, maybe ski trips at £1,000. So there's all those types of extracurricular activities that children or young people from low income backgrounds don't have the same access because they face these financial barriers. In terms of moving away from money, if we look at the social capital aspect of it and you look at social network theory, young people from low income neighbourhoods don't tend to have the same access to networks that you do when you go on to university, or you do when you step from outside of your own local community. And I think that has a lot to do with how we can navigate these spaces as well.
Yeah. Emma, you make a very valid point, particularly around what might be described as the informal activities that are going on in the world of education, and particularly your final point there about the sort of networks that people have and how that can be as powerful as the results you might have at A level. Now, Emma was an elected member for quite a number of years, and I think you were a junior
Jennifer.
minister.
Oh, yeah.
Or Jennifer, sorry, Jennifer. You were an elected member and you were a junior minister. Are these the type of discussions that were going on at the Assembly and the committees and various things about the role of education? Because you were in a privileged position to know this.
Yeah, yes, there were. I think that you hit on two of the key issues in terms of why there is so much disadvantage in that. And I think that the two of them are academic selection, and the other one is poverty. Because I think that there are two key issues. Now, they're not the only issues, there's other issues there as well, but I think there are two key issues that have to be tackled. Obviously, I'm not going to go into the whole debate about academic selection because it would take a whole section up of this, but I mean, I think that most people, in my opinion, who would see children and at 11 years of age and be able to say, that's your future at 11 years of age, and this is where you go and that's where you go, and they're slotting those children into different sort of places, I think is totally wrong. And I think until that is really tackled, the transfer tests and all that, I think that we need to, that's going to be a main issue. But another big issue is poverty. And you talked about it, because I think there's something, I can't remember, but I think there was something like 8 or 9 different sort of sectors, educational sectors, that was, when you went through them, there are private schools, you have, all different sort of segregated schools there in terms of children, learning. And in my opinion, education should be about bringing children together. It should be bringing people together in terms of looking forward to the type of, if you like, a citizenship that they, that even the curriculum should be based on what people want to aspire. Because education just isn't about educating people. Education is also about setting the parameters for people in life in general as well. And I think that in terms of that, and I mean also early intervention is a key issue which needs to be, in my opinion, more money put into nurture units, which have worked very, very well in some of the schools, particularly where there is social and economic disadvantage in areas. And I think that those are a key issue as well. And I think that the emphasis on exams and the emphasis on children passing exams and getting those qualifications, that needs to be looked at as well, because, and these are conversations, by the way, that do happen. Unfortunately, you have different ideological ideologies in between different parties, if you like, and I think that's where particularly around academic selection is concerned. And I think also in terms of poverty, we need to be looking at where we can best put money in terms of, you have the like of Sure Start, for instance, and it's not just in schools, and when kids are born, just when the kids are born. The other thing that was a big issue as well, extended schools, and something that was very heavily debated, I think at one time, was we have all these schools in buildings, if you like, that close down at 3:30 whenever the schools finish in a day. And I think that they should be opened in terms of for youth provision in the evenings and at weekends. You talked about sport, for instance. You've got a lot of schools now that have sporting facilities, should be opened up to people, the young people, for the use. And I also think that when just, and I suppose in one sense, West Belfast in particular, and it was something that we had sort of had a lot of debates in and around, was the actual experience of the West Belfast Partnership partnering with St Mary's in terms of the Easter schools and the summer schools, but also there was a bit of research done where community-based education, when it linked in with schools, was one of the things. But the attainment, the education attainment in the children actually they increased. So, I mean, you need to look at the good practice, and we need to think. And one of the other key issues I have to say as well, because we are an island, we have to harmonise the whole sort of qualifications as well across the island, because people now are and I think that in terms of the Irish medium, it's very, very good the way that and the progress that they have made in that. So I can remember my 3 children went through primary education in the Irish medium, and it was more like a community. You know, the school was they did the extra curriculum things but it was more like a sort of a community where people came, together with all different events and that as well, with parents as well. And that was another, because some of the schools in West Belfast again, there was like parenting groups that would have went in. I can't remember the title of it, but it was like the parents went to school with the children, and they actually sat in the class with the children, and the teachers got to know the parents and all that. So all those issues, yeah, they were all debated. Unfortunately, obviously the executive and the assembly, the way it was, you had to have all party agreement on certain things. But I think the key things for me is educational, academic selection, and most definitely poverty. And until you tackle those things there, that you're never really going to have that situation that you want to aspire to. And I pointed out, and Emma said it as well, not to be looking at just solely formal education in terms of academic education, but looking at vocation. All kids have talents, they've all talents and they've all skills. And our education system needs to nurture every skill and talent to that best potential, because every child is deserving of a chance, in my opinion.
I just wanted to add something to what Jennifer said, because I completely agree with what she said in terms of community involvement within schools. And we close our schools, as she said, at 3 o'clock, and then they don't do, and sometimes for especially working class parents that I have spoken to, schools are a barrier to education, and sometimes the principals and the teachers don't have a conversation or don't have a good relationship with the parents, and that is a big challenge at trying to face that barrier. The community involvement, I do think that sometimes we put everything on the school, and the school needs to do all these outreach and the school needs to do this. But I do think that sometimes a community-based approach, as opposed to leaving school principals to be the decision makers for everything, I think it's the community need to lead those decisions. If we want to tackle underachievement, it needs to be community-led and community-driven, those decisions.
Robert, if I could put this to you, I mean, you mentioned when you were introducing yourself and your education, a very strong aspirational aspect to your life. You were saying, your parents really wanted you to do well, get into the grammar school, etc. There's a reality, however, could I suggest, for employment, and employment is critical to everyone, that there are qualifications required, and there are simply far too many young people leaving our schools with no formal qualifications. And that means they're entering the labour market essentially with nothing.
No skills.
No skills. Yeah. So what's your view on that? Because I think that's critical.
Well, going back to my own school days, Peter, particularly within, well, think of all working class areas, but the working class area I came from, which I can speak more about, there was a great emphasis on manufacturing. In the area I came from, you had Harnham Wolff, you had Shorts, you had Sriracha Works, you had all those big companies of Mackey's. You followed your father to a certain extent, and that was where your aspirations lay. Whether you had academic prowess or not, by and large, people went into the same industries. That doesn't apply anymore because those industries are dead. There's 100 people working in Harnham Wolff now. When I left school in 1970, there was 20,000. And that's just an example. But that didn't prevent you from wanting to do well academically. But I feel, and something that I spoke to Emma about on the way over, I think within working class areas, particularly in Belfast, there's an acquiescence amongst people, and there's this belief that this is our lot. People tell us we're downtrodden, we're underachievers, we're undereducated. Must be true. And I think there's a psyche that says, I'm not expected to do well. And that builds on people, that heaps on people, I feel. So putting that into today's sort of, I think Emma's and Jennifer's right here, and there has to be a community approach, and it has to be ground up. There's too much emphasis on principals, board of governors, and teachers or parents associations telling people what they need to do or how they should go about it. And I think there has to be a greater community approach. And as Mickey and Jan has already said, the poverty aspect of things in the foreseeable future is not going to change, because those areas that are classed as poverty-stricken, you know, I can name them in East Belfast, I can name them in West Belfast. Is it going to change soon? I can't see it. But there definitely has to be some concerted approach to take it in a different direction. And I feel from a community aspect that has to be done.
Mickey, when I listen to your words of introduction, you are immensely positive about your education. Straight in, great education at St. Gall's, great education at St. Thomas's. Do you think that's about today, or is there, I think you're hinting at a sort of almost malaise in some communities about the value of education, about the purpose of education. Is that your feeling today, that there's the same positivity about education, or can that be changed in some way in the modern world?
Well, my touchstones for schooling nowadays is my grandkids, you know, so I can get a wee bit of readings from them, and they like school. But I just wanted to refer back a couple of things which were said by Robert and Emma. But the this big C word is cropping us up here, and I like the use of it, the social class thing. Classes, whether it's intentional or unintentional. I mean, who says, the school principal can tell the community what's happening? Who made that rule? Who says schools are to be judged by frigging league tables? This came out under the Thatcher era, I think in the 1980s. What are the criteria for being up on a league table of best schools? Is it the number of kids who make it in soccer or in GAA? No, it's not. It's in this thing, the solely on achievement of O levels, or whatever they're called, GCSEs or A levels. Somebody makes these rules, and it's never, I don't know anybody who makes the rules, or maybe you do, but I don't. And the other wee thing, and this is not in any way party political, but it gets me that there is a sort of a social or community divide in approaches to the purpose and what should be the outcomes of the education system here, and that nationalists in the main tend to be orientated to the doing away with the differentiation of children at 11 years of age. And there seems to be, in the main, a unionist support for the maintenance of the differentiation of children at 11 years of age or 10 years of age. And what Emma has outlined there is, to me, I couldn't have verbalised what she was saying any better. I totally and absolutely agree with what you said. And then I go to myself, why do people vote for these politicians who make these policies and maintain these policies which allow these things to happen to our next generation, which then self-perpetuates? I think that in the recent year that we've had, a year and a half or whatever it is with the COVID, I mean, just for what it's worth, COVID has so exposed the social class differences. The assumption was, well, if the children aren't able to get to school, they'll go onto their laptops or they'll go onto their iPads, and people were then going and saying, excuse me, where do you get an iPad or where do you get a laptop? We've no money. We are unemployed.
Or where do you get reliable internet?
Well, yeah, all of these things, you'll certainly get it in certain parts of the world, but you'll not get it in other parts of the world. So, I mean, and I'm slightly, and I'm sorry about this, slightly moving into a political stance here, in that the status quo to me here totally reinforces the continuation of unfairness in society. On a personal basis, I'm an Irish Republican. I want to change society, and I hope to be party to changing society for the good. And part of the good for the future is getting improvement on the prospects of our children, and maybe slightly changing whoever set down their criteria for what it is to achieve. It shouldn't be 5 O levels or 5 GCSEs and 2 A level stuff. Sure, there's children nowadays who, and this is slightly into a rant, I heard a woman on the radio about 2 months ago telling how her 11 or 10-year-old was distracted and calling herself a failure for not getting into a grammar school. And I'm going, where did that child get that language from? Who implanted that in that child's head, that was it? Personally speaking, I think it must have been within the house, or maybe the child has absorbed it from somewhere else. Where do we get this from, that even the language? I don't know if anybody else here heard that woman that being interviewed, and I think she's a woman from, it said whatever the school the child was at, from the English community, and I go to myself, this is not fair. Things have to change, and to a degree, it'll have to be our politicians. But let's remember, one of our politicians did try to change it, and it was totally resisted by the Catholic Church, by the Unionist parties, and by most of the mainstream Protestant churches. Martin McGuinness, when he tried to do away with this 11 plus, Katrina Rowan. So, and I don't mean this to be orientated to politics, but as it said earlier on there, it's slightly nationalist Republicans have a particular view, and Unionists have another point of view.
I'm going to disagree with you a little bit there, because I do think it's still very much focused on a class issue.
Yeah.
When we look at what happened in 2009 with the removal of the 11 plus, it was the grammar schools in all sections that came together to formulate the GL exams and the AQA exams, because they wanted to maintain the grammar school system. And I do think, as everybody I think has mentioned in the room, we need more authentic teaching and authentic learning. That doesn't necessarily come from academic, vocational, qualifications. That comes from a teacher being involved and engaged with students in terms of what that particular student's needs are. And we have such a large portion of special educational needs students as well within Northern Ireland, probably disproportionate to other areas, that we tend to forget about when we class vocational and qualifications, because some students have additional needs to sit these exams. And even so my daughter had to sit her AQA to go to the school, and she had to get special educational, I can't remember, but she got extra time basically. But if I hadn't known that I could do that, if I hadn't have been versed in the different aspects that I could apply for, then she wouldn't have been able to get that. Do you know what I mean?
I mean, it's quite clear, obviously, from all our discussions that education is not politically neutral. It's just simply to start to try and pretend that education is politically neutral is the wrong starting point, because it's simply not true. In this society, first of all, we have a division based on national identity. So there's an issue in there, even around citizenship, for example. What does it mean to be a citizen of Northern Ireland? For one, it's one thing, for one, it's another. And it's also going back to this allocation of these resources, because that is an inherently political exercise, going right back to, well, what is the purpose of education? And we're putting £2 billion into it. So, I mean, that's been very helpful, because we've had to be very honest about the political dimensions of education. Now, in that regard, Noel here led, to be fair, it was Noel led it, a very interesting research project in regard to the critical factor of underachievement. And maybe you'd say a few words about that, Noel, and then if people would like to comment on some of the major findings.
Okay, thanks, Peter. So, as Peter mentioned, the stimulus for today's discussion really came from a piece of research that we were both involved in, which looked at educational underachievement from Republican and Loyalist perspectives in Northern Ireland. And that piece of research, we've all had a look at it. Some of us were involved in it more than others, but I think just to summarise it very quickly, there were a number of points of convergence and similarity between both communities, and we've heard that actually already today. Similar issues arose around the importance of family and community, the barriers presented by poverty, social disadvantage, and indeed the Troubles earlier on as well. A sense that there were certain barriers like academic selection and the cost of education, which presented real issues to working class families, and which had been exacerbated by the pandemic, by COVID-19 and so on. But there were also some points where there were differences between the two communities, and I think I want to tease those out a little bit as well. One was in this sort of value of education that was very present within Republican working class communities, and that sort of strong sense of community that was there, and a unity among that community, which was much less present within the Protestant/Loyalist working class community. And we did hear from the Loyalists that we spoke to about that sense of being marginalised, about the sense that politically and educationally, socially, they felt that nobody was really listening to them, that mainstream politicians were less interested in them, that compared to Republican former prisoners, they had much less say and power and influence than in the Republican community. So I suppose I wanted to ask, first of all, starting with Emma and Robert, whether you thought those views, and remember that was a very small scale piece of work that we did. It was a pilot study. We interviewed half a dozen Loyalists and half a dozen Republicans. Do you think, how representative do you think that those findings were in terms of that malaise? I think Peter mentioned that word, a sort of sense of grievance almost among the Loyalist working class community. Do you think there's any truth in that from your perspectives, Robert and Emma?
Me? Okay. Well, I say there's a certain amount of truth in it, yeah, and I'm not sure who you spoke to, the Loyalist representatives, but there were 6 of them, 6 Republicans. I would say you're getting a fair base of what was happening. I think one of the things that I would point out is that from the Republicans you spoke to would feel that they had much more representation politically through the like of Sinn Féin in particular, where Loyalists, on the ground Loyalists, would feel that they're misrepresented or underrepresented by big house unionism, and that's always been a problem. You know, there's a history throughout republicanism that the working classes have been represented by Sinn Féin or big house parties, and that has never ever been the case, you know, for working class Loyalists. They vote for DUP, they'll vote for official unions to a certain extent because they feel they don't have anyone else to vote for. But the true feeling is that they're misrepresented by those parties.
And what does that mean for education on the ground, Emma, then?
So I agree with what Robert's saying is in terms of misrepresentation. I feel like as a Loyalist, you're misrepresented not just by politicians, but also by the media. And it's that self-fulfilling prophecy when we look at young men who are let down by their education, they're in poverty-stricken areas, and then they read these inflammatory comments on social media or media outlets about what they must be. So we really do need to look at that and tackle that. And very much when it comes to voting, it's very much tokenism. The big parties will come round and rap at your door and say, oh, well, we're going to do this and we'll do this, but it's lip service. And I think now grassroots loyalism has woken up and said, no, we're not about to take this anymore. Certainly the people that I have spoken to, and that has an impact on education because it's the status quo that needs changed, and big house unionism has been responsible for that in partnership with the executive and other bodies. And until we get things changed and actually have representation, because for me, so I'm a politics student, representation matters. You need to be able to contact your local representatives so that they fight for the issues that matter to your community. There's many issues that both communities, like education's one of them, social housing is another. And sometimes I think that we focus a lot on what separates us, especially politicians, rather than the shared issues that we need to tackle.
Yeah, that's right. And one of the things that came through very strongly to Peter and myself was the sense of pride in the Loyalist working class community as well. So even though there has been a lot of talk about this underachievement, and maybe that can be a negative, that can have a negative impact actually in terms of expectations as well, there was a very strong sense of pride that this is a community which is maybe, been through a lot, educationally and socially and so on, but a community which wants to move forward. Is that your perspective as well?
I mean, when I went to university, all of the academics were talking about my community. They didn't come from my community, and they were saying pupils there don't have any aspirations. Their lack of parental involvement, and for me and my friends, that wasn't a true representation of me growing up in education. So I did some undergraduate research and spoke to 546 young people aged 11 to 18 at some schools in East Belfast. And they very much have aspirations. They want to be veterinary sciences, they want to be doctors, they want to maybe be pop stars and singers. But we focus on putting them in these boxes based on qualifications and based on what we as adults or we as society think is important. So for me, I very much think that sometimes education can stifle the growth and the creativity of our young people.
Robert, anything you would like to add to that in terms of your
I
perspective?
agree mostly with what Emma's saying. I think there, and again, it's something we spoke about ourselves, and that sometimes there's a blanket thrown over communities, and I think at the moment within certain loyalist communities, everyone's being classed as, I'm not a drug dealer, I'm not a racketeer, I try to be creative and whatever, I work for a living. But when I see some of the stuff on social media and in the media outlets saying loyalism is, it's not. And there has to be a focus on looking at the creative side of loyalism and the good side of loyalism. And I know we're detracting a wee bit here from the educational sort of side of things, but it's all connected. When I went to school, there was a class divide within education. I was lucky enough, as I said, to pass 11 plus. A lot of my friends didn't. A lot of my friends went to a secondary school that had what was called a J stream. And they were brighter kids in first year who were picked and put in the J class. Don't know why it was called J. But it gave them a second chance for the 11 plus. Some passed. I had one of my closest friends at school was a year older than me, came into my class because he went through a J stream in secondary school. But some of my other friends were paid in that school because they came from Malone Road or came from Stranmillis. They're no brighter than me, but they were paid in. So that was always there. There's a divide, and as everyone has said here, it's really it's a class divide, and it's about money, and that has to be eradicated somehow.
Just quickly, what Robert touched on there is something that is wrong with our schooling in terms of separating. We can have that flexibility of a grammar school stream or a more academic stream within a school in like the way that Lygon College does, for example. We don't have to have separate grammar schools and separate secondary schools.
Yeah. If I bring in Mickey and Jennifer there as well then, so in terms of the overall findings, it was a small pilot study, a small number of people who were involved in that. Do you think, is there any, how representative did you think that was, those findings in terms of the broader Republican community and the differences between the two communities as well, Mickey?
Well, we tried to get people from different geographical areas to take part, and which we did. So in general terms, I think you've got a reasonable representation of Republican ex-prisoners' views because we had the male, female and different geographical areas. So to a degree, and we didn't land from Mars into our communities, so we are part of our communities. So yeah, I think it got a fair enough outcome. Here's a problem which I have here, and I'll be honest with you. No, there is absolutely nothing said by Robert or Emma that I wish I had been saying that. Do you want to join Sinn Féin? And why wouldn't you? Because your policies, your outlook are exactly what we would want for society. The problem is the people who dictate what society wants do need grammar schools. They do need division, because if everybody is equal, then there'd be no status and there'd be no social class differentiation. And that is, to me, the major problem. And I'm not saying it's deliberate. It's not deliberate by the providers of the facilities for the teaching of our teachers or for the development of our teachers. But there's some strain which keeps running through, that there is a particular stream of people with particular stream of attitudes, And unless we change that somehow or other, and I don't exactly know how we change it, then things will continue as they be. I thought that one of the major ways of getting a change was to do away with separation of the children at that young age. It hasn't happened. And the people who were foremost and resistant of the change were the people who are in the upper levels of the hierarchy in our society. I mean, it's so obvious. I don't know how to change it. The political party I support tried to change it, and it was resisted.
But in terms of things that bring the communities together, and Jennifer touched on this, things like early years intervention, special educational needs, they united both communities in terms of our research, didn't they?
Yeah, no, and I think that I was very interested in what Robert was saying in terms of their political representation, and I think that's in terms of what you're saying about the key issue is that the people who represent the unionist community aren't from the community. And you actually said it, they don't live in your communities, they don't go to school in your communities, they don't work in your communities. And I think that's one of the key issues, which is different, if you like, in terms of our community. I mean, most of our political representatives live in the local community, they went to school, their children go to school in it, they're part of the local community, and they understand the problems of the local community because a lot of them have had them themselves. And a lot of, most of them are from working class backgrounds. We all know the difficulties that brings. And it doesn't matter if you live in the Shankill Road or the Falls Road, they're the same issues and the same problems that you have in terms of poverty and social disadvantage and everything else. And I think that to me, I can see that sort of a realisation almost of that seems to be coming out more, I think, in society. The reality is that most unionists, and I don't want to get into a political debate here, but most unionist politicians want to maintain the status quo. And in order to maintain the status quo, they want to keep people divided in the way that they're divided, and I mean, to me, it's a lack of leadership, if you like, and I think that's for me something that they're really, in my opinion, letting people down that live in those communities and are from those communities. I think that in terms of going forward, and you said something earlier, and I totally agree with you. Everybody has a potential for talents and skills, and every child has a right to education, no matter what their social background is, no matter what their economic background. I mean, we have a very diverse society evolving here. We have people from all different countries coming to live here. Refugees who obviously maybe didn't make a choice to come here, but were forced to come here. So we have all that. We have the what you're saying, our children with disabilities, we have children. We've also, but they all have an entitlement to education and access to that equality of education. And that means if you're from, and Michael mentioned it earlier, if you're from a family who can't afford an iPad to do their homework or a computer to do their homework, they're at a disadvantage right away. So that's the type of thing there. And in my opinion, it doesn't matter whether you're from the unionist community, loyalist community, or Republican or nationalist community. That's the issues that we need to be tackling. And I totally agree. Early intervention is a key issue, in my opinion. And I think that in terms of then going ahead, I mean, the homework clubs, the breakfast clubs, all those things. I mean, I don't know if they're even still going, but those are the type of things that make a difference. A child going to school hungry isn't going to learn as well as a child that's going with a breakfast. So open the schools to give them a breakfast, and that whole thing there. To me, it's just it makes common sense, and to me that's where the money in terms of would be best spent. And I think, I mean, going back to what you said about it'd be different. You see, most Republican prisoners when they come out of prison. I mean, not all of them. I mean, a lot of them became elected representatives. A lot of them went into the councils. A lot of them were elected as MLAs and went on to be ministers and everything else. But I also think that a lot of them worked in the local community sector as well. And that built up a whole sort of, if you like, a society as well in our communities where, you know, that you there was that support there that maybe, I don't know, I mean, you know more about your communities than I would, I don't know, but all I'm saying is that support is needed, and I don't see the elected representatives who live outside of your communities, who work outside your communities, and who maybe are, you know, their children go to different schools or whatever. I don't see how they can sort of way fully represent you in the way that perhaps maybe that's where, just going on what Robert said, maybe that's where the difficulty is a bit.
Well, I think we're leading on perfectly into the final question, which Peter is going to lead us with. Thanks.
I think we'll wrap up with a simple question requiring a sort of a one-sentence answer. It's always the most difficult one of all. But Jennifer made reference to the status quo. And I think generally during this discussion there has been a view that the status quo isn't working well for a lot of young people. And there is an attainment gap. Right. If you had a chance, what's the one thing that you would prioritise by way of changing that status quo? You know, well, you have this opportunity to meet the education minister and say, right, you need to do this. This is, now there are many other things. I'm not saying that there's silver bullets. I'm simply saying, right, number one, you got to do this. Emma.
Well, I actually did a 9-step policy thing and distributed it to politicians. But if I was to pick one, I definitely think it would be access to funding. And that's in two separate. Access for funding for students who want to go to further education colleges is different to students who want to go on to university. So you can access different grants if you go to university, whereas if you go to college, you don't have access to the same funding. But also funding for initiatives. For me, that needs to be community-led, community-driven and community-focused. And it's not often the community that drive these initiatives. It's outside agencies or government agencies or academics that create, we're going to do this pilot initiative and this is what we're going to do because this is what we think you need. Nobody actually engages with the community and lets the community take the lead. Personally, I'm trying to access funding at the moment for education within East Belfast and I am having to jump through hoops.
Right.
So
your number one is some changes to the methodology by which finance is allocated in education. Got it. Jennifer.
Right, I would have to say it would be quality of access, an opportunity to education, but also tackling poverty. Yeah. I think, and the academic selection, I have to say I couldn't put it, but we have to tackle academic selection, we have to tackle poverty, and we have to give equality of opportunity to all children to access education.
Excellent. Thank you very much. Robert, you're in the hot seat
It's
now.
hard to do in one sentence, but I agree with everything that's being said. Academic selection's a big problem. I think it has to be tackled. The other thing I would say, and something was mentioned earlier on, is the connect between principals, boards of governors, parents' associations, and the actual parents and the kids. I think that's a must. That the parents must know what the kids want and what they need. And I think the schools have to connect with them and get on board with it.
Very interesting, Robert. That's one of the key results that came out of the small-scale research that we talked about earlier.
Well, I think it's vital.
But there's also barriers to that because, like, sorry to interrupt, but like Board of Governors meetings that happen during the normal workday, working class parents can't attend those or be on those boards. And I asked a principal to move one, and he just said no, it didn't suit his teachers. So we need to look at those relationships as well.
Almost the last word, Maggie.
No, I agree with everything that has been said here, but there has to be communal ownership of the education system, and I don't know. That may sound, we'll take over the schools. It's not. It's that there has to be a greater ownership within communities, and I mean I can only speak. I think to do with the maintained the Catholic schools. I think the chair of it always has to be. I'm not sure. But I think the chair always has to be the parish priest, or it used to be that anyway. Come on, we're in 221 here, and people are embedded in the ways of doing things as they've always done. We need a radical shake-up, and if it has to come from the top with orders, then it should be. But we have to make them community orientated. But we also have to, the facilities might be there, But if you haven't the interest or the drive to use the facility, you won't use it. So there has to be, I don't know what the carrot would be to get people to have that's ours and that's what we want to do. We were different in the prisons. We had a political drive to self-educate, to promote what we wanted to do for the future. How we can harness that within communities that they want change, the change in the structures that they can have a greater input. And I'd also, when I'm talking about it, I would do away with these frigging league tables and get rid of them, because that then is the competition for achievement in specific subjects and the height of the subjects and the A pluses. We've got to get rid of that. Education should be rounded.
Okay. I said it was nearly the last word, because Robert jumped in there at
No,
the last
it's just
second.
something that,
So we're getting very close to it now.
Michael's saying about the education within the prison system, and it was for political ends, really. I came through Longcash as well, and particularly Compound 21. I was there for 11 years. And I think I'm right in saying, I can be challenged, that Compound 21 had probably the most amount of people who gain degrees and masters throughout the prison. Not for political ends, but for bettering themselves. No, I did education within the prison system myself, not to degree level, to the O levels and A levels, but you know, I have a friend who is a community worker, and he works with different groups, women's groups, kids, and other groups. And when he's doing some of the sessions, he has his photograph. It's blown up, and it's of 8 prisoners. It was taken in 1983 in Compound 21. And all these guys are suntanned. It's the summer, blah, 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 or salmon shorts. And his opening question is, what do you see? What do you see in this photo? And people are saying, oh, all these guys they're suntanned. It must be summer, blah, blah, blah. But the crux of it is that out of those 8, 2 of them are dead now. There's a senior lecturer in St Andrews University. There's a civil servant. There's a playwright. There's a probation officer. And so on. I said, that's what these guys did.
That must be promoted within the Loyalist communities at the grassroots.
Do you know what I mean? That ethos has to be transferred. And, and people say, you know, we were disadvantaged because we were in prison. But know what?
But you turned that disadvantage to an advantage.
Exactly.
That's what's happened there. Right, we'll wrap things up. Just want to say to Mickey here that you don't have to be the parish priest of the chair of Catholic schools anymore. I just want to clarify that. But the other thing is, do you see those league tables you're referring to? They're banned by the Department of Education now. They are produced by our newspapers for totally different reasons. Anyway, listen, can I thank you in my role as co-chair for the very transparent and indeed very candid way in which you've contributed to this discussion. Sorry for getting your name wrong at the very start, Jennifer, but I managed to pick it up towards the end.
Thanks, Mira.
So I think it's been a very, very useful discussion, very helpful. There's a couple of themes coming through that hopefully those who are going to be listening to this and watching this through the Féile broadcast will be able to disseminate through society, because we all want change. I said that wasn't the final word. Noel, you get the final word.
Thanks very much, and thanks to everybody for participating. And I think that big messages have come through here about actually there's more that unites us than divides us in terms of working class communities, whether Loyalist or Republican, Protestant or Catholic in Northern Ireland. I think we're all committed to improving education for our children and young people, and that's come through really strongly. So thank you very much to everybody.
Thank you.
Thank you.
All right.